Good evening, friends. I'm Pat Mannon. I'm joined tonight by Brother Ben Soto. We are coming to you live from Northwest Arkansas, and we're studying the book of Daniel with you. We are delighted to have you that have joined us. For those of you that will watch us on a delayed basis because of other activities this evening, we want to welcome you at the appropriate time that you watch, and thank you also for being a part of these studies. We have certainly enjoyed this method, this venue of coming to you with the Word of God and studying with you for a while. And we're so glad that you have the interest to join us and that you've given your time, your valuable time, to make these studies a part of your life. Thank you so much. We hope you're profiting from these things. Tonight is the 17th part of our study of the book of Daniel. We will have at least 2 more lessons after tonight. And I hope tonight to get us through chapter 11. I believe that we can. Next week, Lord willing, then we will start the last chapter in Daniel, which is chapter 12. And tonight, there's some very critical things that we're going to study. And so I'm going to ask you to bear with me. For those that might have joined us later in this study, maybe have not looked at these videos, maybe to the extent that some of you have, or maybe thought about them to that extent, let me go back and give just a little bit of summary and lay the foundation for some things that we're going to study tonight. And I hope you'll stay with me tonight, because we've talked a lot in many of our studies about the doctrine of premillennialism. And that comes into play here in Daniel 11. And we're going to get to that tonight. And it should be of interest to you if you're looking to be able to deal with those that are teaching false doctrine, who are talking about a future Antichrist and tribulations and all kinds of different things, who have all of these theories. Certainly you need the information that's here tonight. And if you're confused about all of that, if you'll stay with me, I'll shed some light on that subject in a couple of verses in this particular chapter, chapter 11. Let me take you back to chapter 8. If you'll remember, Daniel had a vision. And if you'll notice the chart down here in front of you, Daniel saw a 2-horned ram standing by the river. And he had 2 horns. One horn was higher than the other. The higher came up last, and we noted that was Medo-Persia. The Bible says it is. So there's the rise of the empire of the Medes and the Persians. When they came together, formed an empire that eventually overthrew Babylon, and they became the world power. Then Daniel saw in that vision a he-goat that came from the west. This is Greece. And he had a notable horn between his eyes. That's the first king, we're told, and this is Alexander the Great. And this goat ran into the ram in all of his fury and just stomped him. Nobody could deliver the ram out of his hand. And this goat became very powerful. And we said that this is Greece coming to power under Alexander the Great, who by the time that he was age 33, had conquered a good part of the world and actually died in Babylon at age 33, drunken and of a fever. Now, after Alexander died, we read that this horn was broken back here in chapter 8, and in its place 4 other horns came up. And I told you that these are Alexander's generals. And these horns, of course, are different nations, different parts of the Grecian Empire that they rule, because when Alexander the Great died, his empire was split 4 ways. His generals took a portion of his empire, of his kingdom. They never had the power he had, but they ruled nonetheless, and they split Greece up and divided it. And a general named Lysimachus took the country of Thrace. Thrace lay right up here, north of Greece, northwest of Asia Minor. So Lysimachus took this. Then there was another general. His name was Cassander, and he took Macedonia. And this Macedonia is over here where Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, cities like that. It lay north of Greece and actually included Greece. And so this was taken by Cassander. Then you had a fellow named Ptolemy I Soter. He took Egypt, this territory right down here, and he's known chapter 11 as the king of the south. In fact, all of the kings that ruled Egypt, that ruled this Ptolemaic empire down here, are referred to as the king of the south, and there's a whole line of them. Now, up here to the north is Syria, and here's the Seleucid Empire, because a man named Seleucus I was another one of Alexander's generals. And he started a dynasty that's referred to as the Seleucid Empire. Basically, it was based in Syria, in the city of Antioch. And so you got Syria, and they're referred to, incidentally, in chapter 11 as the king of the north. So the king of the north is whoever's ruling at that time over the Seleucid Empire up here, or the Empire of Syria. The Ptolemy the First ruled down in Egypt, started a dynasty there, so he started the Ptolemaic Empire. You've got the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire. Eventually, Cassander and Lysimachus over here that had Thrace and Macedonia, they really fade out of view. And the two empires that really remain are this Seleucid Empire, which went all the way to India, and this Ptolemaic Empire down here that was Egypt. These two got cross with each other, and they got in conflict, and I've shown you that laying right in between them is Palestine, the Holy Land. Right in between them is Jerusalem. And at times the Egyptian part of this division of Greece, the Ptolemaic Empire, the Ptolemies, ruled the land of Palestine, ruled Jerusalem and the Jews. For about the first 100 years of the Ptolemaic Empire, they controlled the area of Palestine. Eventually, however, the Seleucids took control of Palestine and a portion of Egypt, and they controlled the Jews. And when they did, it turned out to be a very terrible thing for the Jews. So, back in our image now in chapter 8, remember when these four horns came up in place of Alexander when he died and split his empire and divided it in four ways. They were Thrace, Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt. Out of Syria, out of one of the horns, Daniel is told that there is going to come a little horn. This is a king. His name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He is the villain in chapter 11. And we've been studying him now for quite a while. I told you back in chapter 8 that we would run across this fella when we get to chapter 11. That's exactly what we've done. And so he came out of Syria. He's the king of the north. He's one of them that ruled Syria, okay? So when you read of the king of the north in chapter 11, you're reading of the kings that ruled Syria, or the Seleucid part of the empire. And the king of the south, you're reading about the Egyptian rulers, the Ptolemies. All right? Those things noted now, I took you to chapter 10, 11, and 12. I told you that Daniel 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, the last 6 chapters of Daniel contain 4 different visions that Daniel had. They all fit back into the first 6 chapters in the time frame that they occupy. But there are 4 visions there left from 7 through 12. Chapter 7, we have a vision of 4 beasts that come up from the sea. Chapter 8, we have the goat and the ram, and the rise of Medo-Persia and the rise of Greece, and how Greece becomes the world empire. Then in chapter 9, we did the 70 weeks of Daniel, and now we get to chapter 10, and when we do, chapter 10, 11, and 12 are all one vision. They're all one. So you got a vision in 7, a vision in 8, a vision in 9, and then in 10, 11, and 12, you've got another single vision. And it's the one we've been studying now for several weeks. It basically is a vision of what's going to happen to Daniel's people, the Jews, and to Jerusalem, leading up to the end of the Mosaic age, or the Jewish dispensation, the Jewish age, if you will. And that really came to a literal physical conclusion in 70 AD when Rome conquered Jerusalem and killed 1,100,000 Jews in that city. Destroyed the temple, destroyed the city, and destroyed its priesthood and its sacrificial system, and it's never risen again to this day. Since 70 AD, there has never been a Jewish priesthood that offered sacrifices upon a Jewish altar at a Jewish temple in the city of Jerusalem. Rome leveled that place and it's never risen again. Now, that said, uh, we're talking in chapter 10, 11, and 12 about this last vision. And Daniel, as I said to you, has been given a vision of what's going to befall his people and the city of Jerusalem at the very last of the Jewish age. And it's not pleasant for Daniel to see all this and to be told about it, because he's learning that his people are in for a great deal of suffering and death, destruction, persecution. And it's just very unpleasant history. He's being shown future history. That's really what he's being given. History between the testaments, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so it's not good news for Daniel in so many ways, and he's just terribly grieved. And Gabriel has comforted him. He's been sent to him now in chapter 10, and God has sent him to help him understand this vision, to explain to him what's going to happen to his people in the latter times of the Jewish age. The vision itself is given in chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 10 is the setup, it's the explanation, it's the foundation for the vision. But the actual vision itself is given to us in 11 and 12. It has some difficult places, especially when we get over into 12, but 11 is full of that difficulty too. And basically, it takes us, it really skips over Persia and cuts to the chase, if you'll allow me to use that term, in getting to Greece and the Jews' situation under the reign and rule of the Grecian Empire. That's really what chapters 11 and 12 are about. What's going to happen to the Jews at the time Greece is ruling, at the time they're a world empire, and some of it carries over into Rome, of course. And so when we get to chapter 11, and we did a verse-by-verse study, and friends, I gave you a paraphrase of chapter 11. This is just the last page of it here, but I took you through verses 1 through 35. I gave you the Bible text, and we went over to the right side, and I gave you a paraphrase of what that verse is saying. We did that through all 35 verses. May I call your attention to the fact that back at verse 21 in Daniel 11, and I wouldn't mind if you had a Bible open and you want to turn to Daniel 11, that would be wonderful. But in verse 21, the narrative switches to the villain in this book, and his name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He's the little horn that comes out of the Syrian portion of the division of Greece. And he is a mad persecutor of God's people, the Jews, of Daniel's people. And of course, he does much damage to the city of Jerusalem and especially to the temple. So we started in verse 21 studying with him. Now let me tell you why chapter 11 and the part we're in now is so important. We're going to start in tonight at verse 36, and we're going to study through verse 45. But in verse 36, the king of the north, the king is mentioned, and there's all different kinds. In fact, there's 5 different theories at least as to who the king is here in verse 36. Some say that it's Herod the Great. Some say it's the Antichrist. Some say that it's Russia. Some say that it's Rome. As for me, I say it's still Antiochus IV Epiphanes. I'll lead you through these 5 different theories. Also, I would remind you of this. At verse 40, there'll be a pronoun, him. And Hal Lindsey, who wrote several books, premillennial books, such as The Late Great Planet Earth, Countdown to Armageddon, The Rapture, There's a New World Coming, books like this. Hal Lindsey makes this pronoun in verse 40, and I want to show you this. He makes that pronoun refer to Antichrist. There's another fellow that Lindsey studied under in Dallas Theological Seminary by the name of John Woolvard. Wolverd was a big supporter of premillennialism, and Wolverd says that the pronoun him in verse 40 refers not to the Antichrist, but to Israel. And so it's really very interesting what these men do. And I want to show you just the blatant switch that they make. And the reason this chapter is important, if you will learn what this chapter is about, you're going to need that knowledge to defeat premillennialism. And that's what I'm trying to give you. We're studying the book of Daniel for the sake of knowing Daniel, but in knowing Daniel, understand that you're going to be able to refute a lot of the popular false doctrines that are in the world today, in fact, that have swept this world, the religious world, and are so popular today in all of mass media, in books, in the internet, of course, videos, productions of all kinds, even movies. And so you'll be able to dispel those false doctrines and prove them false if you'll just stay with me here in the latter part of chapter 11 in the book of Daniel. Now, what I want to do is take you back into chapter 11 at verse 21. I told you that the king of the north here switches to a single man. Now listen to me very carefully. From Daniel 11 and verse 21 all the way through the end of Daniel 11, which is 45 verses, all the way through the end of the chapter here. The king of the north is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. It doesn't change. In fact, he runs into chapter 12, which is still part of this vision that continues. And so this man really occupies a good part of the last of the book of Daniel, the last couple of chapters. He occupies Daniel 11, verse 21, on into Daniel chapter 12, okay? Now, you need to understand this, and it's going to be beneficial that you do. So what I want to do, I want to go back now and show you these switches that people make. I want to read the text, starting at verse 21, and I want you to stay with me and pay attention. I know that the contents of this are hard to understand. I've already explained them for you last week in a paraphrase. And now I want you to be catching something else as I go through them. But I want to read these verses. You stay with me. When we get to verse 36 over here, then all of a sudden, premillennial people start making a switch. It'll refer to the king, and they'll say, well, it changes now. From Antiochus IV Epiphanes, it changes to someone else. Lindsay makes it Russia. Modern day Russia. And when he does this, friend, he creates a whole international war that involves Russia and Egypt and black Africans and Persians and Orientals and all different kinds of people. He just gets a whole world war started out of the switch of who the king is in verse 36 and spawns him a whole theory of premillennial nonsense. That's what he does. Then down at verse 40, we read, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. See that pronoun him? Lindsay says that's the Antichrist. Now you couldn't get Antichrist out of there with a crowbar, but Lindsay can. And John Wolverd comes along and he says, no, the him there is Israel. You can't get Israel out of there either. You cannot get a modern day Antichrist out of Daniel chapter 11. It's not talking about our day and age. It's not talking about our future. It's talking about the future of Daniel's people near the end of the Jewish age, which ended around 70 AD. And if you'll understand that principle, then you won't get confused by these false doctrines. I'll show you the subtlety, in some ways, a blatant switch that these men make. Now let's go back to verse 21 with those things said, because I need to get underway and get this done tonight. Daniel 11, verse 21, I'm going to read through the end of the chapter. You watch the switch, you watch the statement at verse 36 and verse 40. I'll remind you when we get there. 21. And in his estate shall a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, But he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. This is Antiochus. This is where he's introduced, this vile person. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province. And he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches. Yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with him, with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both of these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief. They shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Then shall he return into his land and with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. And at the time appointed he shall return, and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter, for the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Therefore shall he be grieved, and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them of understanding. Now watch these next two verses carefully. Some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed, and the king shall do according to his will. Now you see where it says the king? Lindsay says that's Russia. You see, all of a sudden he wants us to believe now that in verse 36, Daniel's quit talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. Now he's talking about modern day Russia. See? And he's just inserted that. Just inserted it out of thin air. There's no evidence that this is Russia. It's just referred to as the king. And every time that we're reading about the king of the north, and everybody agrees this is the king of the north, he just says the north is Russia. You see, arbitrarily says that. But every time in chapter 11 we read of the king of the north or the king of the south, the king of the north is always Syria and the king of the south is Egypt. There's no exception to that. They do not refer to an Antichrist. They do not refer to Russia. They do not refer to Rome. They do not refer to Herod the Great. They refer to those that rule Syria, this Seleucid Empire to the north. And the king of the south refers to the Ptolemies, to those that ruled Egypt. And there's no exception to that. But you see, where it says the king, since it didn't say king of the north, or since it didn't clarify itself completely, Lindsay just switches it to Russia. Because you see, he's got a theory. He needs Russia to attack Egypt and to form allies there, maybe conquer some of the parts of Africa, Black Africa there along the Mediterranean. Persia gets them involved, and he creates a whole international war, Armageddon, out of Daniel chapter 11. He reads of Armageddon over in Revelation, and he brings that nonsense of his theory over here to Daniel 11 and tries to find it here. See, and create a big international war out of chapter 11 and put it in a modern day setting. It does not fit there. So let me read this now, 35, and I'll go on down into 36. When we get to 40, I want to show you something else. And some of them of understanding, verse 35, shall fall to try them and to purge and to make them white even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. And the king shall do according to his will. He's still talking about Antiochus. And he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. Now watch verse 40. And at the time of the end, this is not the end of time, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Who is him here? Well, we've been talking about the king of the north. But you see, Lindsay needs to create this international war. And he says that him here is referring to the Antichrist. Now, friends, do you see an Antichrist here in verse 40? At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. When you get John Wolverd's position on this, he makes him Israel. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, Israel. Lindsay says, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, Antichrist. Both of them are wrong. I'll show you that when we get to the comments here in just a moment. But now I wanted you to see these switches that are made in this chapter in order to prove the theory of premillennialism. You have to watch false teachers. They're very subtle. They'll take a king, they'll take a noun here that refers obviously to Antiochus Epiphanes, and they'll make it Russia. They'll take this pronoun him, and one of them will make it the Antichrist, and another will make it Israel, and they'll spawn a whole theory off that, and they'll divert the text in order to sway it over to the theory that they already have in their head when they come to this chapter. See, their problem is they have adopted premillennialism, and when they come to chapter 11, that's all they can see. And they need verses to fit their theory. And so they come into these battles that are raging between Syria and Egypt. And they will make them an Antichrist or a modern day Russia or Israel or Egypt or such countries as this, and create a whole international incident and a war. They do it very slick, very subtly. People don't notice the switch that they make in the pronouns. And that's why we have to study these verses very carefully and know when we come to the pronoun him, who it's referring to, or when we read about the king in verse 36, know what king he's talking about. Because if we don't know that, we will swallow premillennialism. And these fellows will deceive us. And that's what they've done not only to millions today, but millions in the past and probably millions in the future. It's a horrible theory, and it's not going to go away, and you might as well learn to study it and deal with it. Because if the world stands, not only will you be dealing with this doctrine, your children and your children's children will be dealing with it as well. Now, let me get back to verse 40. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, over the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore shall he go forth with great fury to destroy and to utterly make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. All right, that's chapter 11 now, and that's where we want to get to tonight, is through verse 45. We're starting at verse 36 because we've done the first 35 verses. I wanted you to get the whole reading from 21 on down through 45 because it is my judgment, and I think I'm very correct on this, that verse 21 down through 45 in chapter 11, every bit of it is dealing with Antiochus IV Epiphanes, that little horn that I told you about back in chapter 8. And that this runs even on into chapter 12 as the vision continues. I'll have to show you that in the next study. Now, with the text there read now, let's come to chapter 11, verses 36 to 45, which we're dealing with. And let me give you a little bit of discussion and clarification as we move on. Before I get into the commentary of these verses, and I'm very anxious to do that with you, give you verse by verse, and I'm going to give you a paraphrase of these verses, just like I did with the first 35 verses. Before we proceed with the commentary on these verses, though, there's a matter of controversy that I've been talking about regarding the king here in verse 36 that we need to discuss and get some clarification. While it's true that the words the king here in verse 36 still refer to the king of the north, several different positions are taken as to who the king of the north is. And there are 5 prominent positions on this king of the north that we're going to examine. And I'm going to do them briefly, but hopefully enough to give you an idea of what the truth is about them. Some say the king here in verse 36 is Herod the Great. Others say that king is a future Antichrist. Some say the king is Russia. Some say the king is Rome. And some say the king is still Antiochus IV Epiphanes. As briefly and yet as thoroughly as necessary, I'm going to make some observations on these first 5 theories. I'm not going to spend very long on this first one because it's a theory that the king here, when I read verse 36, we read here that the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt and magnify himself above every god. See, he's still talking about Antiochus, but there are some that say, no, this is Herod the Great. But the view that Herod the Great is the king here in verse 36 won't fit any historical record that I know of. Because Egypt, who is the king of the south, never pushed at Herod. They never did. There never is a record that Herod attacked Egypt in return, as happened in verse 40 when the king of the north came against Egypt. In addition, Herod never took treasures out of Egypt. He never controlled Libya. They were never at his steps, Libya and Ethiopia, as mentioned in verses 42 and 43. There's no way that Herod fits the king of the north here. And so we just simply reject that theory. Thankfully, not too many people hold this view. But the next one is popular. They tell us the king here, when it says the king shall do according to his will and exalt himself and magnify himself above every god. They tell us this is the Antichrist. Now, the view that the king of the north here is the Antichrist is held by many premillennials. And I have mentioned Hal Lindsey, but I want to mention another fellow that I don't talk about very much. But he is a forefather that came along before Hal Lindsey, before John Woolward. And this man's name is Clarence Larkin. Clarence Larkin, Larkin. And here's how Clarence Larkin interprets the text of Daniel 11 here on page 118. I'm going to quote from his book, which is called Dispensational Truth. And here's what Larkin says now. regarding Daniel 11 in these verses here. Quote, that the king of the north spoken of in Daniel 11, 21 to 31 was Antiochus Epiphanes, there can be no question. But that he was not the little horn, or the Antichrist who is to come out of Syria in the latter days, is clear from the remainder of the chapter. From the 35th verse, which describes the conduct of the future Antichrist. The intervening verses, 32nd to the 35th inclusive, fill in the gap between the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and the appearance of the Antichrist. Now, really, what Larkin is just saying in that quote, unquote, what he's saying is that from Daniel 11 and verses 21 through 31, Antiochus Epiphanes is the king of the north. He says there's no doubt about it. He's right on that. And then he says, and in Daniel 11, verses 36 to 45, the king of the north is the Antichrist. And friends, he's wrong on that. He says the intervening verses of Daniel 11, verse 32 to 35. See, he's saying up to verse 31, you've got Antiochus. Then at 32, you lose Antiochus and it changes. Then he says at verse 36, the king of the north becomes the Antichrist. So you've got verse 32, 33, 34, 35. And he says those four verses right there are they're basically the intervening verses that just fill a gap between the time of Antiochus and the rise of a future Antichrist. Let me draw it out for you this way. When you're in Daniel 11, he's saying 21 to 35 is all Antiochus Epiphanes, and that's the king of the north. I'm sorry, 21 through 31. I'm even getting confused myself. From 21 to 31 is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. This is Larkin. Then he says at 32 it switches. 32, verse 33, verse 34, verse 35. This is an intervening period. This is a gap. It's intervening. It's a gap. Antiochus Epiphanes, folks, died in 163 BC. There has been no future Antichrist yet. And premillennials believe he's still yet to come. So this gap has been here. See, they just shut the clock down. And they put a gap in here at 163 BC at the end of verse 31 when Antiochus dies. And they say these other four verses are just filling that gap of time. That in verse 36, Larkin says this is the Antichrist right here. And he's still future from our day. So what they're trying to tell you is that now for over about 2,200 years so far, this gap has been here, and it'll be here till Antichrist comes. And we're supposed to believe that verses 32, 33, 34, and 35 in Daniel cover this long gap that's already run 2,200 years already. See, that's what these fellas do. They've got an Antichrist in their future, and they want him. And they don't mind going to Daniel 11:36, and where it refers to the king, they make that king the Antichrist. And just pull him right over into their theory and change the whole context of Daniel 11. Friends, that's what premillennialism does. The whole theory of premillennialism is full of these kind of switches, these kind of subtle changes in the text, the insertion of ideas and theories, of individuals and of nations for pronouns and nouns. And they just switch it any way they want. And what I'm trying to show you is you've got to know these things in order to deal with premillennialism, and that takes study. Now, you'll have this video to refer to, and you can go back and reflect upon it and meditate in it, and hopefully get this better in your mind. I'm trying to show you now. We've come to verse 36. And now Larkin and them tell us this is referring to the Antichrist when it refers to the king. So he says that Daniel 11, verse 32 to 35 is just simply the intervening verses that fill the gap of time between Antiochus and the coming Antichrist. Therefore, we've had this now over 2,000 years. At verse 36, as I told you here, Mr. Larkin says that the king of the north changes from Antiochus Epiphanes to the Antichrist. But when you read Daniel 11, verses 21 to 45, there is no such change in the king of the north. The Antichrist, folks, is just not in the text. He's just not there. You can't read Daniel 11 and get a future Antichrist. He's not in there. The whole chapter from verse 21 through 45 is dealing with Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So this theory of Herod is wrong, and the theory now of this king being a future Antichrist is wrong. Now that brings up another theory, that the king is Russia. I told you earlier about verse 40 to watch the switch now that is made. The view that the king of the north here is Russia is held by many premillennialism, including Hal Lindsey and John Wolford. All the premillennialists agree that in Daniel 11, the king of the south is Egypt. They don't have any problem with that, and they're right. The king of the south is Egypt. And if we accept the premillennial view that the king of the north is Russia and that the king of the south is Egypt, let's examine the pronouns here in the text of Daniel 11. As we do, I want you to notice the switch that Lindsey and Wolford make at verse 40. Now, I'm going to read you Daniel 11, verse 36 to 45. And when we get to certain pronouns and nouns, I'll show you what Lindsey believes, and I'll show you what John Wolford believes about it, okay? Quote now, I'm starting in at verse 36. And the king, which is Russia, that's what he and Wolford believe, and the king, Russia, shall do according to his, Russia's will, and he, Russia, shall exalt himself, Russia, and magnify himself, Russia, above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Verse 37. Neither shall he, Russia, regard the God of his, Russia's fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he, Russia, shall magnify himself above all. But in his, Russia's estate, shall he, Russia, honor the God of forces, and a God whom his, Russia's fathers knew not, shall he, Russia, honor with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he, Russia, do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he, Russia, shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And he, Russia, shall cause them that rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south, Egypt, push at him, Israel, says Lindsey. The Antichrist, says Wolford. And the king of the north, Russia, says Lindsey, shall come against him, Israel, says Lindsey. I'm sorry. The Antichrist, says Wolford, and the king of the north, Russia, says Lindsey, shall come against him, Israel, says Lindsey. The Antichrist, says Wolford, like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he, Russia, Lindsey, shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. He, Russia, Lindsey, shall enter also into the glorious land. We're getting to verse 40 now. We've done been to 40. Shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his, Russia, Lindsey's, hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. He, Russia, Lindsey, shall stretch forth Russia's, Lindsey's, hand upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he, Russia, Lindsey, shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his, Russia's, steps. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, Russia. Therefore he, Russia, Lindsay, shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. And he, Russia, Lindsay, shall plant the tabernacles of his Russia's palace between the seas and the glorious mountain. Yet he, Russia, shall come to his, Russia's end, and none shall help him, Russia. So I know that's confusing, but let me show you what's happened here. At verse 40, Lindsay changes the pronoun him, who's actually the king of the north, Syria, changes them to Israel. He makes the pronoun him in verse 40 Israel. When the Bible says right here, let me get verse 40 here for you. At the time of the end shall the king of the south, Egypt, push at him. And Lindsay says that's Israel. But you see, he's still talking about the king of the north, and that's Syria. Lindsay says him here is Antichrist. So he's put Antichrist into the text, see. So Lindsay changes the word him, who's actually the king of the north, Syria, to Israel. In so doing, he creates an international war that involves Russia, Egypt, black Africans, Arabs, Persians, all on the misuse of the pronoun him. He's created a whole war right here between all those nations with modern day Russia. Isn't that amazing? The king of the north in Daniel 11, 36 to 45 does not change to Russia, friends. It still refers to Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. Daniel's being told about what will happen to his people at the end of the Jewish age, and that age is long ended, see. And I'll have more to say on this later. The pronoun him in verse 40 refers still to the king of the north, and that's Syria, and not Israel or some future Antichrist. So the view that Russia is the king of the north in Daniel 11, 36 to 45 is just completely fabricated into the text. So we reject the idea that the king is Russia. So far I've shown you one theory, that the king of the north in 36 is Herod the Great. It is not. I gave you a second theory, that the king of the north, according to Lindsay, switches to Antichrist in verse 40. It does not. I've shown you that the king of the north is not Russia, as Lindsay and Wolford say in some of these verses. The next theory that I would mention to you is a theory that's held by a man that I have very profound respect for. And let me tell you a little bit about this gentleman. I'm not sure whether he's alive or not. I really think he is. But I'm referring to a man by the name of Jim McGuigan. Jim McGuigan. McGuigan is from Ireland. Excellent teacher, a very scholarly man, and I'll tell you very plainly tonight, I have profited very greatly from his writings, from his teachings, from his explanations. Probably he has helped me more to understand who the beast is in Revelation and in Daniel than any single individual that I've ever read after. He just seems to nail it. Lindsay has some books that he's written that are very profitable books. I don't agree with everything in Lindsay's books no more than he would agree with me. But he's likely much more scholarly than I am. And he's written a little book on Daniel, and he's written another book on Revelation. If you want to get those books, that's fine. You'll find some profit in them. I don't know how much you'll agree with, how much you want, but I've learned so much off Jim McGuigan. Now, I say that to tell you this, that Brother McGuigan, and he's a member of the church, Brother McGuigan believes that the king of the north here switches to Rome in his judgment. And he makes that case in his book of Daniel. I'm not going to come in. I've got the notes to do so in my notes. I'll come in and show why I think what McGuigan's position is, and some of his positive arguments in favor of Rome and reasons why I don't think Rome fits. I'm not going to come tonight and slam this man that has been such a uh, a great influence for me in learning a lot of this material. I would just urge you, if you're interested in the view that the king of the north here switches to Rome, that you go ahead and read Lindsay's argument in his book on Daniel. You can order that book, or you could probably download this section if you need to, and probably might even be able to read it off the web. I'm not sure. But if you want his arguments, I will let you go and get those. I do not believe that he's right. I do not think there's a switch to Rome. Lindsay insists there is. He and I are not Lindsay, but McGuigan, and he and I just disagree on this. If you want to get McGuigan's book on Daniel, then you can read his argument there for yourself. 4 different views. Herod the Great, we've shown you is not right. The Antichrist, not found in that text in Daniel 11. Neither, not only is the Antichrist, neither is Russia, modern day Russia. And I do not believe McGuigan is right when he says that it switches to Rome. I don't see anything in verses 36 down through verse 45 where the text changes from Antiochus Epiphanes in any of those verses. I think Antiochus Epiphanes is spoken of at verse 21 and runs all the way through the chapter. What I think was really going on when we get down to verse 40 is that Daniel's just giving an overview. He's giving a review of the life of Antiochus. And so I'm going to leave it at that. To me, there is no change in chapter 11 at verse 21 to the end of the chapter. The king of the north is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. It runs all the way through 11 and right on into chapter 12. Now, in the time that Ben and I have left, let me give you my commentary here on verses 36 through 45. First, let me read the text of 36 to 39. I'll come in and give you the commentary. We read, and the king, and he's still talking about the king of the north, the king shall do according to his will. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. 36, having discussed the controversy now surrounding the supposed switch here at verse 36, let me remind you that the identity of the king of the north here in 36 has not changed. We're still dealing with Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Throughout chapter 11, Daniel consistently referred to the king of the north as the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, Syria, and the king of the south as the ruler of the Ptolemaic Empire, Egypt. In verses 21 through 35, we've been dealing with Antiochus IV as the king of the north. There's nothing here at 36 to indicate that a switch has been made to another king or to another kingdom. If a change has occurred, we'd certainly have difficulty in determining that change, wouldn't we? How would we know the identity of who the king is if it switches from Antiochus and it just mentions the king? How does Lindsay and Wolford know that the king there is Russia? How do they know that? See, they've just read that in there. Daniel is just simply at 36 through 45. He's going back and giving a review of the character and rule of Antiochus IV. He's going to go back and enlarge upon things that he's already dealt with and mention some of these things again. And I believe that's what he's doing. And the reason he does is Antiochus had such a horrific effect, such great persecution on the Jews that Daniel is given a lot of information about this man. Now, let me say this about Daniel going back and giving reviews, giving additional information. In Daniel chapter 2, we have the image of the kingdom, that great dream of Nebuchadnezzar where he saw 4 world kingdoms. Daniel had a vision in chapter 7. Friends, he mentioned the same 4 kingdoms. He just enlarged upon them a little bit and gave us more detail. Then in chapter 8, with the vision of the ram and the he-goat, Daniel took 2 of those kingdoms after the division of Alexander the Great's kingdom of Greece, Syria and Egypt, and he expanded on those a little bit. In fact, he really took Medo-Persia and Greece and expanded on those. Then he went further in chapter 11. He expanded further on this Grecian part of the division of Alexander's empire when he brought in Antiochus IV Epiphanes. In short, what I think we've got here in 36 through 45, we've just got Daniel being given a further review of Antiochus Epiphanes, and some of it is repetitious. It refers back to battles that he'd already engaged in. Verse 36 again, point 2. Antiochus fits the description of a man who exalted himself and did according to his own will. He magnified himself above every god, even the true living God. Because in 169 BC, friends, Antiochus gave himself the title Theos Epiphanes, and that means God manifest. He claimed to be a manifestation of God in the flesh. This man claimed deity. He claimed deity. And so, even on the Cohens that he had struck, he proclaims himself as Theos Epiphanes, okay? And he prospered till we're told here that he had finished his course upon the Jewish nation, because it was God's purpose that this man be allowed to persecute the Jews in order to separate the wicked out from those that were faithful and to purify the faithful and make them to be tried and to make them white. Verse 37. Daniel's told that this king, still Antiochus, would not regard the God of his fathers, and this was certainly true of Antiochus IV. He spent many of his early years as a hostage there in Rome, and a considerable number of years there at Athens. And so he had as much regard for Roman and Greek gods as he did for the Syrian gods or anybody else's god. And he'd worship any god that might be expedient for him politically. But through his Hellenistic policies, especially among the Jews there, he sought to force people to worship the god or gods of his own choosing. In the case of the Jews, he set up a statue of Zeus in their temple and demanded that he be worshipped. In fact, he offered to him. And because of this statement, it says he wouldn't regard the desire of women. There are some that think, well, maybe he was homosexual. That may be true historically, but it seems more directly related to his persecution against women in general, because if a woman circumcised her son, Antiochus killed her. Let me just read you a quote from the book of Maccabees. 1 Maccabees 1, verse 60-61, quote, "At which time, according to the commandment, they put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised. And they hanged the infants about their necks, and rifled their houses, and slew them that had circumcised them," unquote. So they killed these women. He didn't regard the desire. He had no desire, or didn't regard the desire of women. Verse 38, the vision states Antiochus would honor the God of forces. And this is an accurate description of him. He used force to crush anyone that stood between him and his desires. And the vision pictures him as honoring with gold and silver and precious things, gods that are unknown to his fathers. And that's likely a reference to this Olympian Zeus, or this god that he placed an idol of there in the temple at Jerusalem and caused sacrifices to be offered in. Again, I want to read from Maccabees regarding that. First Maccabees 1, verse 54 and 55, quote, "Now the 15th day of the month Caslu," that's December 15th on our calendar, "in the 145th year," that's of Greece, "they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar, and builded altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side, and burned incense at the doors of their houses and in the streets," unquote. That's in 167 BC. They offered, they set this idol up there in the temple. Verse 39. Daniel is further told that this idolatry is going to occur in the most strongholds, that Antiochus IV would rule over many and divide the land for gain. He certainly did that in several cities and countries, especially in Jerusalem and Palestine. Jerusalem was a stronghold and he subdued it. And its land and its loot was divided to some of the individuals among him. You see, he developed this policy that his fathers never had done. When he would conquer a place and he would get gain and loot from that place, he divided that among his soldiers. He would give them a cut of things. This kept them satisfied. It kept them fighting. It kept them loyal to him because, you see, he's lining their pockets as they loot and pillage other nations and such things. In fact, this was a very common practice with him. Verse 40 to 45 now. I want to finish this and then give you a quick paraphrase. Here's the text of verse 40 to 45, and then I'll come in and give you the commentary right quick. "At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, Moab, and the children, or chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him." Now this is the one where McGuigan says this refers to Rome. It's not referring to Rome. Verse 40. "The messenger tells Daniel that at the time of the end," that's not the end of time, it's the time of the end, "that the king of the south, Egypt, the Ptolemies, would make a push at the king of the north." That's still Antiochus IV. The time of the end is not the end of time. It's a reference to the period near the end of the reign of Antiochus IV. There's no accurate historical record of an invasion of Egypt, by Egypt against Antiochus. And we're still being given an overview of things that occurred during Antiochus's reign. And this is really what happened. F. Bruce, in his book on the history of this, describes this by saying, quote, "Sometime in the winter 170 to 169 BC, the Egyptian government declared war on Antiochus. This was an act of great folly because it gave Antiochus the excuse and the opportunity to attack Egypt. He'd been wanting to attack Egypt, but Egypt was an ally of Rome, and Rome would not allow you to attack their allies because they would deal with you then. And he didn't want to get into a war with Rome because he couldn't win that war. But he didn't have a good excuse to attack Egypt. Well, Egypt attacked him. Or at least they plotted to attack him. And when he learned of that plot, that gave him the excuse he needed to attack Egypt, which is what he wanted to do all along. See, that's really what we're being told here. Still quote, the Egyptian forces were about to invade Syria with the aim of bringing it once more under Ptolemaic sovereignty, when Antiochus struck first. Crossing the frontier with his army, he defeated them so thoroughly near Pelusium that the way into Egypt, lay open before him. He advanced to Memphis, and there his nephew came to him with an embassy to discuss terms of peace, unquote. That's from F. Bruce, who wrote a book called Israel and the Nations and told about this particular part of Antiochus's reign. Now verse 44 or 40 to 45.2. What you have in 36 through 45 in Daniel 11, you've got an overview of the activities of Antiochus. There's no switch to Russia, to Herod, to an Antichrist, or to Rome. It's still Antiochus. It's just giving a review of some of the things in his life that are already covered in earlier verses, but this is an enlargement upon them. The overview of Antiochus' reign continues with a description here of his victory in Egypt. He indeed entered Palestine, which is called here the glorious land. Edom, Moab, and the chief of Ammon did escape out of Antiochus' hand. As Mr. Bruce described there in that quote that I gave you, Antiochus' army advanced deep into Egypt, even down to Memphis. They conquered a lot of territory. And this description by the heavenly messenger here, Gabriel or whoever that's telling this to Daniel, is extremely accurate. The Libyans and the Ethiopians were literally at his step. Antiochus took a lot of treasure out of Egypt. That's also true. All of this fits Antiochus. But he was eventually defeated at Alexandria in this campaign and forced to leave Egypt in great anger and in humiliation. And while he was there in Jerusalem, the vision mentions that tidings out of the east, out of the north, trouble him. While he's still in Egypt, word arrives that the Parthians over in the east were in rebellion against him. That troubled him. He began to hear rumors out of Jerusalem, the north, that he'd been killed down there in Egypt in that war, and that troubled him also. And he heard that there was also a war going up in Jerusalem, going on there. He's already angry. He's already humiliated there at Alexandria. And so he passed through Jerusalem and he took his anger and frustration out on the Jews. It says that he would go forth with great fury to destroy, to utterly make away many. So he takes his anger out on the Jews. He consequently planted the tabernacles of his palace between the seas. That's the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. That's Jerusalem, see. And so it was at this time that he robbed the temple at Jerusalem. That's what's being referred back to. He eventually took away their daily sacrifice. He set up an idol altar in the temple. He imposed Hellenism, the Greek culture, upon the Jews, persecuting them and torturing them and killing them, murdering anybody that was disobedient. And then the messenger tells us of his death. He says that he shall come to his end and none shall help him. And I think I read to you back in an earlier lesson the death of Antiochus IV. If you'll remember, he was eaten of worms internally. He was eaten from the inside out. His flesh rotted as he was coming out of Persia, headed to Jerusalem. He never did make it. And he died on the border, I suppose, between Persia and Babylon. But the stench of his body was so bad his soldiers couldn't even stand to be around him because of the smell. He literally was just eaten from the inside out and died a horrible, horrible death, unspeakable death. And it says that he came to his end and none would help him. That's certainly very true. All that's described for you in the book of Maccabees, and we've read that. Now, before we close chapter 11 tonight, let me give you a paraphrase. Like I did the first 35 verses, I'm going to give you quickly verse 36 through verse 45. Here they are. I'll go from 36 on the text to 36 on the paraphrase. 37 text, 37 paraphrase, all the way down. Verse 36, here's the text. And the king shall do according to his will. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Now the paraphrase. And the king, Antiochus IV, will do as he wants, exalting himself above every god by calling himself Theos Epiphanes, God manifest, and even speaking against the true living God. He will prosper until God's indignation and wrath upon the Jews is accomplished, for what God has determined will be done. Verse 37, he shall not regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. Paraphrase, he shall have no regard for the God of his fathers or for any God, neither will he have compassion for the cries of women, but will torture and kill them. He will exalt himself above all. Verse 38, but in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. Paraphrase, in the place of all gods, even the God of heaven, he will honor the God of forces, a deity of power and conquest, and a God whom his fathers knew not, Olympian Zeus, he will honor with vast treasures and expensive gifts. Verse 39, thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And he shall cause them that rule over many, he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. Paraphrase, this is how Antiochus IV will conduct himself in the various strongholds he shall conquer. He will honor and glorify this foreign god, Zeus, causing both it and himself to rule over many. He will also divide the lands for his own profit. Verse 40, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Paraphrase on verse 40. Near the end of Antiochus's reign, the king of Egypt will push at him by declaring war against him, and Antiochus IV will swiftly attack Egypt with many armaments, by land and sea, and with large forces. He will enter deep into Egypt and conquer much land and take many treasures. Verse 41. Here's the text. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. Paraphrase, Antiochus IV will also enter into the glorious land of Palestine and conquer many countries within it. However, the Edomites, Moabites, and the chief of the children of Ammon will escape and not be conquered. Verse 42. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Verse 42, paraphrase. Antiochus IV will conquer many countries, all at this time, and the land of Egypt shall not escape out of his hands. Verse 43, text. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Verse 43, paraphrase. But Antiochus IV will steal the treasures of Egypt, including gold, silver, and other valuable things. He will advance so far into Egypt that Libya and Ethiopia will be within his reach. Verse 44. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and to utterly make away many. Verse 44. But news from the east, a Parthian problem, and out of the north, fighting at Jerusalem. will trouble him. Therefore Antiochus will enter into Palestine and take out his anger upon the Jews. Now verse 45. And he shall plant his tabernacles, the text, he shall plant his tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Verse 45, paraphrase. Antiochus will move the tents of his palace between the seas, the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, near Jerusalem. However, he will come to his end by dying a horrible death, and none will be able to save him. Now, friends, there is the end of chapter 11, but the vision continues on into chapter 12. And Lord willing, that's what we'll deal with next week. So we hope you can join us. I hope that this has helped you some in chapter 11. There is no switch at verse 36. The king is still the king of the north, and that's still Antiochus IV. At verse 40, it does not switch to Rome. It does not switch to Russia, does not switch to Israel, does not switch to an Antichrist. There is no switch to Herod the Great. This is still talking about Antiochus IV. He's still the king of the north all the way through this chapter. That's what you need to know. You go back if you need to and rethink these things and meditate in them and study them again. Ben and I will close now, and as we do, we want to thank you for being part of our study. We're glad to be able to come to you by this venue, and so glad that you are interested enough to join us in the study. Hope that it's been profitable to you. As always, we wish you a wonderful week ahead. The weather's getting hot here in the southern part of the U.S., and for those over in the southeast and even in the deep south, looks like it's going to be warm weather. We hope all of you are safe and that you'll stay cool. That God will bless you. And as we leave you tonight, we wish you a very pleasant good evening. We hope that God's richest blessings will be upon you. May God bless you. Until next week, Lord willing, we'll see you then.